Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. Not so long ago, I was in Baghdad talking to a Shia militia leader about what would happen after the major military operations against Islamic State slow down a little bit. And one of the things that I'm concerned with, that I think everybody who is working in Iraq is concerned with, is that there could be some tension between the different forces that are fighting Islamic State together now, the Shia militias being one of them. So he was saying all these things that sounded pretty good, like, well, we don't want more escalation, we've suffered enough in Iraq, we know what this is like. I wasn't entirely sure that I believed him, maybe from the way that he was saying it. And as he was walking us out, he said, well, thank you, I'd like to meet again, maybe we can meet each other in this particular place that we had been discussing that still needs to be liberated from Islamic State. In fact, that is right now on the point of being liberated. And so we said, yes, that would be very nice, thank you. And then as we left, and I was the last one leaving, under his breath, so very silently, he said, when we liberated from everybody. That may sound a little bit insignificant, but what he was saying was the exact opposite of everything that he had just said to me, namely, they want to control that area and liberate it from the other forces that they are currently fighting with. It was not a good day. I was not having a good day. That was one of those situations where you're in a place that is very in a poor state, that's seeing a lot of violence, and already you're talking about a next phase of violence while this one is still very much there. Unfortunately, that's a reality in my job, to not have good days and to deal with violence upon violence. What I do is I'm a mediator in armed conflict. I talk to leaders of parties to a conflict with the aim of reducing violence. Depends on where you work, how ambitious you can be. I work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, or Iraq, Libya, Burundi, Basque Country. You've already heard Georgina mention a few. I wanted to talk to you tonight about some of the, almost like the silver lining, the more uplifting things, because I think if you look at the media and in my job also, every day we are confronted with things that are very difficult to handle. But I think, I look around this room, there are a lot of us here who are invested, I think, in peace and contributing positively, and there are things that you can do, that we can do, and that's why I wanted to talk to you about listening tonight. A lot of my job is about listening to people who have killed people, sometimes a lot of people, sometimes in really awful ways. And I don't just sit in the room with them and listen to them speak words. I sit there and I have to understand what they are saying, where they are coming from, which of the things that they are saying are important to them, and which maybe less so, and why. The reason for that is because I'm always trying to get some compromise, some little step forward. And so if I understand where that could be possible, that's important. If I understand if there's a place where I can still push a little bit more, that's important. And also if I talk to the opposite party, if I already know these things, it helps things move that much quicker. At the same time, it's quite challenging to be talking to people who do these awful things all the time, in one way. And in another way, it's also very everyday. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that today. I just want to highlight a few things that I've learned that help me listen to them better, even though it's hard sometimes. But before I do that, I want to say something about me that's personal, that I don't really talk about all that often, but that I think has relevance to this topic. I have a brother, and he is 3.5 years older than I am. His name is Pepijn, and he is very severely mentally handicapped. He can't speak, so he is mentally like a 1-year-old, and one of the things that means is that he can't speak. So I have spent some part of my life, and I'm still spending some part of my life, listening to him communicate in a way that doesn't involve words. For example, he has autism, or autism behavior, and he doesn't like people coming close to him physically. And he also doesn't really look people in the eye very much. So it's very easy to miss, but if he looks you straight in the eye, that's a really big thing, because that really doesn't happen very much. And what that means is that he's feeling particularly good at that time, maybe, or I don't know, maybe brave enough to connect with you, or he's very interested in something that you're doing. These are things that over time I have learned about him, but I think the nonverbal aspect of communication generally is very, very important in my work, and I think so having a brother like that is challenging. It's also beautiful sometimes, but it's also helped me do my job, I think, better, because I am trained in that aspect. And I think it's important to be aware, all of us, that those things matter in listening to somebody and communicating. So having said that, one of the things that I wanted to say about what helps me listen better in my job to these people that do awful things is that I try to go in without too much judgment. Now, this is very, very hard, because without exception, you know who they are. It's usually not good. You know the context, so you also know what the violence they perpetrated means. And also they have a tendency to tell you about it. I don't know what that is, if they want to get it off their chest, but it means that as you have more meetings, you have more specific details of what they have done. And still, I try to go in without that determining how I look at the conversation, which is very, very hard. And it's an extreme example, but I think all of us, when we have interaction with other people, be it somebody who votes, for example, for a populist party that maybe you completely disagree with, or is from a very different background, you also go in with these preconceived notions that can really affect your conversation. For me, I found that what really triggers that it's hard to get away from that judgment is when it comes too close to me. So when it becomes personal, and that's really when I have to remind myself and try to sort of be open enough to hear them. The hardest time that I've had listening in my job was in the Democratic Republic of Congo, when I was talking to the FDLR. They are a rebel group who were responsible for the genocide in Rwanda. They are still very violent in eastern DRC. And we were talking to a particular part to try to persuade them to no longer be armed and go to another place. And so that involved me going to see them and talking to them. I have a Jewish background. Aside from that being a very, very difficult situation for anybody, I think, the fact that they were, in the conversation feeding me their genocidal ideology while you have an awareness of what that means, and the fact that that means something to me personally. I grew up with people, saying things about that to me, meant that I really was struggling with those conversations very much. And to be really honest, I don't know if I would necessarily want to do that again. But I did struggle through, and in that particular case, because I very much believed in why we were doing it, and if it would work, I think it would objectively be good. But it was very, very hard. The other thing that I wanted to highlight that helps me listen is, in some ways, maybe a little bit similar. It's about reminding myself that these people, exactly as you just said, are human beings as well. I find that when I talk about my work, people tend to think in terms of monsters almost about the people that I work with. And then they're a little bit taken aback when I talk to them about these people as normal human beings, because I spend a lot of time with them. So sometimes I see their family or, One of the times when that was the human aspect really came through for me was with a group in Europe that I worked with for 6 years that we ended up disarming. There were 3 leaders, and throughout those 6 years, I had 2 children, and they all had children, and I didn't have any before we started, so it was a big change in my life. And I found myself during the course of those 6 years and in the conversations thinking about particularly the woman because of the physical aspect. Here is a leader of what is classified as a terrorist organization who is on the run from the authorities, and she was pregnant. I mean, maybe I'm the exception, but when I was very pregnant, I could not run, for one thing. And also pregnancy has a medical aspect. Like, How did she get medical care? Where did she give birth? And then there's the kicker, which is what was really hard to think about. They all left their child somewhere with somebody else. It wasn't with them. And as much as I was acutely aware of that she was a person who did things that, you know, are awful and that victimize people and that I take huge issue with, she was also somebody's mother, and she wasn't with them. And I found that it really helped me to go through that process and ask those questions in order to stay open and listen and empathize. And I think that's a big part of listening, even with people who do awful things, because they are still people. And then the last thing that I wanted to say about what helps me listen better to these people is that I need to remember that they are these complex beings. So it's in a way what I had just mentioned. They do all of these awful things, and yet they are also human beings. And I find myself, when I explain my work, sometimes saying, we help them give up their violence, which is kind of a strange thing to say, as if you need help giving up violence. But I do kind of feel that way, having worked with these people for several years. It's not an easy thing, because you're a human being, you're invested in this thing, even if it's wrong. You had your reasons, even if we don't think they are justified. And you live this life of violence that you gave things up for. That was how you spoke, that was your power. And then if you were asked to stop doing that, sometimes you need a little bit of help, because you are a human being. And even though they are the last people usually who you would hear this say, it has been my experience that it helps to think about it that way, that they need a little bit of support, that they need a little bit of sympathy. I also find that personally quite conflicting, because you are so aware of what they have done. So I find that this listening act that I'm describing is always a balancing act for me as well. Closing off, I would like to return to my brother very briefly. And I'd like to say that I think having somebody like that so close to my heart, who is very out of the ordinary, has helped me see value and beauty and worth in unsuspecting places, maybe. And I think in a way that's where understanding and listening starts. And I wanted to share all of this with you because I think it's good for all of you and all of us to be in our power in that way and be aware that we can sympathize with others even if they are very different. And I think that would make a big difference if we all do a little bit more of that. Thank you.